webinar as part of the Captive Review virtual series. So we actually started the virtual series in light of the pandemic last year, I'd say just about in May, and it's definitely come a long way. We've had about one or two sessions every month, and here we are still today. So I'd like to thank all our sponsors for helping this happen, and a special thanks to our sponsors today, Carr and Ingram. So before we start, I just wanted to mention that anyone who's missed any previous sessions, these can be found on demand on the Captive Review Virtual Series website, which is captivereviewvirtualseries.com, or you can also find these on our direct website, captivereview.com. Also, for any updates or any last-minute updates, please do visit our LinkedIn page and follow us on Captive Review. And lastly, I'd like to encourage everyone to keep our Q&A session as interactive as possible. So please do use Slido to ask any questions, which can be done by scanning the QR code on screen at the moment or visiting slido.com #CaptiveReview. So for today's session, we will be discussing captive domicile considerations. Should I stay or should I go? And our experts today are going to be diving into the basic overview of domiciles, driving forces in redomiciling and remaining decisions, as well as key considerations during redomicile processes. And I'd like to introduce you to our moderator today and partner at Carr, and Ingram, Scott Bailey. Hello, Scott.
Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks, Mancy, and thanks to Captive Review for having us. We've been looking forward to doing this for quite some time, so many thanks.
Thank you, Scott, and I'll let you introduce the rest of the speakers and get along with the panel.
Fantastic. If you could move to the next slide, please. So I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues with Carr, and Ingram, as well as a captive insurance veteran, Gary Osbourne from Risk Partners. And I'll start with Steve Williams, who is really our captive insurance leader within the firm, our guiding force, our guiding light. Steve, if you'd like to introduce yourself just a little bit.
Scott's always too kind. Thanks again for having us here today, but I've been with the firm for quite a while, and my area of expertise has been the alternative risk markets. Probably the last 20 plus years, I've worked with risk retention groups and captives and kind of that alternative market. So with the firm, I'm kind of part of the financial services team, and where I kind of specialize in that area.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm also joined today by Stephen Lorady, who is one of our newer partners, but one of our captive experts. And we're really glad to have you with us here today. Stephen, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Sure, thank you, Scott. As Scott mentioned, my name is Stephen Lorady, and I'm a partner in our Nashville, Tennessee office. I've been serving in the captive insurance space for close to 10 years now. Really got started with the growth in the Tennessee market and have been serving that domicile within the firm.
Thanks. And Gary, I don't know who we would talk to that doesn't know you, but if you'd like to introduce yourself as well, love for you to do that.
Good morning, good afternoon. Gary Osbourne, Vice President at Risk Partners. I definitely feel like when I start saying I've been in the captive business since 1985, I've been around a while. I've worked in Bermuda, Vermont, Hawaii, and South Carolina. Physically worked on those domiciles, and I've also probably been involved in setting up captives for redomestication. And I added up the other day 23 different domiciles. So looking forward to questions. I can help, even dumb enough to say I might be able to take a few European questions. I've been involved with Malta, Gibraltar, and Dublin over the years, as well as most of the Caribbean and North American domiciles. And thank you, CRI and Captive Review, for letting me join in.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's our pleasure, Gary. If we could move to the next slide. And really just a brief overview of who we are as a firm. We are a CPA and advisory firm. I know it sort of translates to sort of the American version of the Chartered Accountants and we're largely located in the southeastern United States, moving from where I am here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I forgot to introduce myself, but that's where I am. I've been in captives for quite some time. Moving all the way over to New Mexico. So we're at the moment, our firm is largely national in focus, although we do work with many organizations in and around the international space, several international entities that we work with. We're a top 20 CPA firm, depending on the time of year you look, just depending on when people measure. And we've grown tremendously over the last few years. Obviously, we're here today because captive insurance is one of our areas of focus, one of the areas where we really enjoy spending our time. It's a fantastic area. So there's a lot more story to tell, but some of it's probably not as interesting for what we're here for at the moment, but we'd love to chat with you more about our firm. If we could move to the next slide. As Mancy indicated, where we're going to start is just sort of looking at some of the things that are happening, what primarily over the last 10 years, and that's been sort of a deliberate focus. Then we're going to take a look into some of the data. We'll try to keep this as high level as possible, just so that we're not sitting there in the statistician's office all afternoon. That's kind of like sitting in the dentist office all afternoon. And then we're going to round it out with some discussions on some things we see coming forward, what we think is on sort of the near-term horizon, perhaps some speculation on the long-term horizon. And then any questions you have, we'd love to answer those. Again, if you could put those in Slido. And we do want this to be a very, very interactive session. So as much as you've got, we'd love to answer. Next slide, please. So just to kind of kick things off, and we did sort of title the session, it's a shameless ripoff of The Clash, and I hope you won't judge me harshly for it, but there's just a lot of stuff going on right now, using some technical terms, because we're seeing a lot of movement between domiciles. We're seeing varying growth rates in different domiciles. There just seems to be a real shakeup of what we're seeing in the market, and it's the result of a lot of different factors. It's the result of a lot of different geographic locations finding interest in the market and trying to tailor their regulatory schemes to that. There's always tax implications when it comes to captives, or really businesses of most any kind, and the related compliance activities, costs, related items. And we're just sort of seeing how we have these newer domiciles really shoring themselves up, trying to learn the lessons from some of the more experienced domiciles, those that have been out there for quite some time. And I think we're seeing some changes in existing domiciles as a result of that too. It's sort of the captive insurance statutory arms race to a certain degree. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do first, and we're just going to take a few minutes to sort of lay out the last 10 years, just because we feel like this is in getting us to where we are today, probably some of the more relevant items to the current market. So Steve, if you wouldn't mind kind of leading us off and talking through what some of the changes we saw, and while I recognize that this is primarily for our U.S. offices and U.S. captives, kind of talking about the Dodd-Frank Act, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, and sort of what we've seen through that.
Sure, thanks. And you guys feel free to chime in at any point in time. But yeah, we thought we'd look at kind of the last 10 years, because what we've really seen is a lot of movement, and we've seen offshore coming onshore. We've seen onshore moving around within the different states. We've seen sale captives, going into pure formation. So we've seen a lot of movement, and we think some of those driving factors really go back. If you go back and you kind of start back in 2011 when Dodd-Frank came out and we're still trying to digest the ramifications of that, as our last bullet point down there kind of points out, is that all kind of stems back from Dodd-Frank that came out and was really not meant to target captives or, to affect them at all, based on talking to several people within the industry, and then some statements that came out, is they had no intent to even address captive insurance when they came out. But one of the things that came from there was kind of this talk about self-procurement taxes and home state and that discussion that we'll kind of get in and touch on. But that was kind of one of the first things that kind of caught our attention, and people kind of really started to take notice of and kind of see how that's going to affect their captive, their tax status, or were they going to have to pay home state taxes in addition to the premium taxes that they were already going to pay. So kind of started driving this movement. And then in 2014, you had the FATCA came out again. The IRS is starting to kind of to put some regulations out there on captives for U.S.-based companies that are domiciled offshore, whether it be the Caymans, BVI, Bermuda, Guernsey, wherever they're at. The IRS is kind of get some information. 2015 rolls along, and the IRS has always kind of had an eye towards the captive insurance market. But in 2015, they kind of drew their line in the sand and placed them on the dirty dozen list. And then shortly after that comes Notice 2016-66. The IRS begins to place this administrative burden on captives to require, quite a bit of informational reporting. The 8816 came out of that, which, the IRS began to gather that information and really start to gear up for what we would see over the next few years, and are still seeing today. And then one of the things that kind of hit everybody that was offshore, not necessarily domestic, but was when Solvency II came out. And Gary, we were talking about this the other day. When the Solvency II came out there during 2016, you begin to see these additional capital requirements. Some of those requirements were quite large. It seemed to make staying in certain domiciles or starting up in certain domiciles very difficult for a captive to kind of put that kind of capital into a captive starting up, and that a lot of movement.
Absolutely. Gary, what were kind of some of the things you were seeing with Solvency II?
Well, the issue is that generally and I've got to be careful about the Solvency II requirement was like €3.5 million as the sort of minimum capitalization. And there are still not very many European domiciles within the EU that are offering cells. So we saw some activity in my company, previous company. We tried to see some activity in Malta because Malta was one of the few places that were allowing cell captives. And it's interesting because if you look at the Malta statistics, you don't see that many captives, but they were actually forming them. They were forming what would have been considered captives before as insurance companies, because it was no longer really necessary to be a captive when you had to meet the 3.5 million anyway. So a lot of them became actually just regular insurance companies in Malta rather than captives. So sometimes you see the captive statistics from Malta, it kind of hides the true story, and you also don't necessarily get the cell numbers. Obviously with Britain leaving the EU, this is going to be another change that's coming to the market. We're not sure how that's all going to play out. I mean, there's been some swinging back and forth, Gibraltar, Guernsey, Malta, people moving from one to the other as well because of the Brexit. So that's another area that's going to be of interest going forward, is where the British, which have always been one of the, probably in Europe, Britain has probably had more captives than most of the other countries. I jokingly used to say that Britain's catching the American lawyer disease quicker than the rest of Europe, but it seems to be spreading everywhere. But that's been a big driver in Europe, is that the Solvency II, they didn't get sort of specialized treatment. The equivalency they were trying to get never really happened. And the captives just didn't have the same kind of clout in Europe as they've potentially could say they've got here. And so Europe has been a problem since 2016. And we're beginning to see activity again in Europe because the hardening market is hitting Europe as well. And so even with some of these obstacles to overcome, and again, potentially in Britain, because you don't necessarily have the solve, it's still unclear what's their final solution to Solvency II will be, but you're starting to see some more interest in the UK especially, as well as continental Europe. And I think we might see, if I'm jumping slightly ahead to some of these future considerations, we can talk about what might happen with cells in Europe, because I think that's going to be something that seems like a very good option for them down the future.
Sure, sure. Thanks for that. Here domestically in the U.S. In 2017, while we were dealing with a lot of shakeup, we got a new tax law that really altered things a little bit for us. Stephen, you want to talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act briefly?
Yeah. So, obviously that was a pretty, widespread act that had a lot of implications. I think where I've seen it anyways with my client base in the captive space is really that reduction in the overall tax rate we were seeing at the corporate rates down to 21%. So, really from a tax benefit standpoint with the captives, with the lower tax rate, that obviously reduced some of that tax benefit. And I think, over in a couple of year period, we had the PATH Act that came out that from an 831B standpoint reduced some of that income shifting potential that some 831Bs were taking advantage of with the lineal descendants, and then with the increased enforcement, through the IRS that we were seeing in several of those cases. And then a couple of years later, you have the Tax Cut and Jobs Act hit. I think all of those combined together, as we'll see later on, is why, I think we saw over the last several years a shift away from a lot of 831B captives if they didn't have a strong risk management reason. If you had some of them that were formed, right or wrong, to take advantage of tax benefits, we really saw some of that start to diminish over those couple year period.
Sure, absolutely true. And I'm really going to kind of let the next bullet point we had slide a little bit, just because I think we've all probably talked about that topic more than any of us care to or want to. I think that one's been beaten up in pretty painful detail. But the last point that we have here, I think, is pretty interesting. And Gary, if we could start with you on what Washington State has put before us just a couple of months ago.
Well, as usual, I'm not going to be shy, and I'm basically going to say Washington State has passed an unconstitutional law that basically is applying itself over other states' rights. Basically, Washington is saying, for instance, to Vermont, that we're going to regulate your captive. What happened is that Washington State a couple of years ago started throwing fines around at people saying they were doing business in Washington. I have to back up probably just a fact and say, in America, there are generally what are called, I think in that first tab, self-procurement taxes, which basically it's not the captive that pays it. That's one of these things that I think most people miss. The captive is not due to pay the self-procurement tax. The insured would be the one who would have to pay the self-procurement tax. So on our side of the industry, we're always trying to warn people, the captive's not going to need to pay it, but you may want to check with your tax advisors. Stephen probably gets this question, and Scott quite a bit. When is it appropriate to pay self-procurement tax? And that's an incredibly grey area. The issue we had in Washington, there's no captive law, and there's actually no self-procurement law. So Washington decided that we were all in violation of the surplus lines rules, and we were selling insurance in Washington, whether you were or weren't. So they started putting large fines on Microsoft, Google, Alaska Airlines, Starbucks, Costco. I think those are the ones. I may have got the right names, I hope. And unfortunately for the rest of the captive industry, the sort of compromise that was come up worked for the big guys, but is very detrimental to the captive industry as a whole, and extremely worrisome as a trend that others might follow. Basically, they agreed that it's a 2% tax, and then that wouldn't be the end of the world if that was what all they said, but then you're also supposed to register with the state of Washington and agree to have a certain amount of capital. And so that registration is very problematic, and I'm going to pick on one of my tax colleagues here to see why, but because in some ways to me that's almost like admitting you're doing business in the state. And in the United States, we're very careful in our captive world to try and deal with mind and management. One of the arguments we've been making for decades, 35 years in my case, is that we are not doing business in Washington. If I'm a Vermont captive, I'm doing business in Vermont. And I think the problem has obviously been that maybe as an industry we've been a little lax on that front, and so there's been room to go at it. But the Washington approach, and the tax guys can chip in, is we were hoping somebody would have the guts, cojones to fight it, but nobody did. The big guys have rolled over and left us with a mess. And the concern is states like Pennsylvania or California that don't have a captive law might try and do something similar. And then we may not, so we may have, hidden the corner and taken a beating, but it may end up to being a really serious challenge. So I'll pass that back to the tax guys to see if they think differently, but I think that's my kind of.
So not only did Microsoft leave bugs, they left the bugs in Microsoft Outlook, but they also rolled over on the captive thing too.
I think you really nailed that, Gary. For the Microsofts, the Starbucks, those companies, the fines that were being assessed were just pennies. I mean, I think Microsoft ended up paying somewhere just shy of $1 million, which to Microsoft, that's about like a cup of Starbucks. But you make a really good point in that for years, as long as I've been in the captive industry, if my captive is domiciled in Vermont, I'm doing business in Vermont. My premium tax is paid to Vermont. My annual meetings are in Vermont. Everything is based there in Vermont. And accordingly, that's kind of where everything has been governed for as long as I can remember, even after, Dodd-Frank came out and there was all this talk about it. There were several people that were a part of that came out and said, no, our intent wasn't to target captive insurance. But, Washington came out and made it mandatory, basically, as you mentioned. It's a mandatory reporting for any company doing business in Washington and utilizing a captive insurance company to register with the state of Washington, as Gary kind of pointed out there. And that's the first in the industry that I've ever seen. And it started, I think, back in 2018. And then I think last year, maybe in August or September of 2020, they kind of came out and told the companies that they would kind of hold off on the prosecuting or the penalty side until they got their law kind of worked out and their legislation figured out. And then, just this year, that legislation has kind of come down, and it really didn't offer any relief. It was really the kind of the worst that we could see there. But I totally agree with what Gary said, is that for as long as I've been working with captives, whether you're domiciled in Vermont or North Carolina or Tennessee or wherever within the U.S., that's where you've been considered to be doing business.
Well, they're almost redefining the concept of nexus for the tax folks in the room. It's a really interesting thing. Gary, you had another thought?
I probably slightly disagree with Steve. It's not 100% clear as to who has to register and who doesn't, and that's part of the problem. It is clear if you're headquartered in Washington, you must register. But depending on how you interpret it, and again, that's always a problem when it's not clear. I can agree with what you said, that it might be if you're doing business at all in Washington, you're supposed to register. My understanding from some talking with Washington attorneys that it was supposed to be headquartered in Washington. That was kind of the compromise, but the wording is unfortunately not that specific. And so I've actually heard some of my captive clients say they're going to drop Washington from their programs just because it's not worth that potential problem. And the thing is, they're not just doing this going forward. They're talking about going back 5-10 years. So they're looking at collecting like 29 million in premium tax going backwards. So it's very concerning. If you think of that's Washington. If you suddenly put that idea into some other larger state, like it's one of its other West Coast brethren just below it, I don't want to put ideas in their head, that number could be dwarfed. So it's something as an industry that I think we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to, and may have to, much as we've heard of Scotsmen, dig in our pockets and fight, because it's definitely the short-term approach, and it's not a good one for the long term if it becomes contagious.
For sure. So, we've spent some time talking through all these factors, and a lot of these have led us to what, in our view, is leading to a lot of the redomiciling, redomestication, the movement, the formation. It's influencing all these trends we're seeing and where captives are and what they're doing. If we could move to the next slide. So we've sort of broken them out based on all our discussions here. We won't talk through all of these, but just maybe hit on some of the highlights here. We've already talked through a lot of what's going on from a regulatory perspective, at least with Washington. Stephen, any other thoughts there on what we're seeing in the regulatory environment? What we're seeing some of the different domiciles doing?
Nothing really as far as specific with any domicile. I mean, I think what we're seeing in general in the market with a lot of your domiciles, both some of the more mature ones, and then especially with some of the newer maturing domiciles, is really focusing on an ease of redomestication, flexibility in their structure, and with coverage placement to really try to I don't know if persuade's the best word, but to get more of the companies that are located, headquartered within those domiciles who have captives, offshore in a different state within the U.S. to try to move that business back into their state. I think along those lines, you're seeing a lot from the taxation standpoint as well with premium taxes. I know several of the domiciles here within the U.S. have either implemented or floated the ideas of premium tax holidays for captives that are redomesticating to their home state. And so again, I don't want to say anything specific with any kind of domicile, but I think just in the general market, that's kind of what we're seeing with it.
Absolutely.
If you want, I'll be dumb enough to be specific.
Let her rip.
New York became a captive domicile and has actually become problematic to operate in. It's still proximity, or if you're a New York company, but there's been captives. Stewart Shops was basically told it wasn't a captive, even though it had been approved by a captive as a captive in New York. Its left hand, right hand didn't even know what it's doing. So it's quite problematic for when I agree with both Steve and Stephen, and the home state is kind of your first thought. But when you get people like New York doing this, you've even got to double back and go, if a captive makes sense, yes, we want to start with New York, but are we doing anything different, anything too clever that's not going to work? And I'll jump to Texas is the same problem. I've had quite a few Texas headquartered companies that won't fit the Texas law. The Texas law is probably one of the poorer ones that are out there, in that it was probably, we jokingly in the industry call it the AT&T bill, because it was written specifically for AT&T, and so it works for big companies. It's useless for anybody with a slightly creative ownership structure or multiple owners. And it's enough, Texas seems to have backed off a little bit. They were threatening to tax anybody that was a Texas company doing it elsewhere. But since they've done it and they've sort of realized that their law is not the best, and it's not the Texas Department's fault, they're actually been pretty good to work with. But I've got people that have got multiple family ownership or different things in it, and it just doesn't work with the Texas law as written. And so those are two of the obvious ones. They're where you would normally start by saying, oh, it's a Texas company, let's put it in Texas, but sometimes that doesn't work. And same thing with New York. So there are some specific examples where the home state doesn't work and you end up still going to the more traditional ones of Vermont, South Carolina, Hawaii, or something else, because the business reasons overwhelm the potential tax issues.
Steve, are we seeing any domiciles either domestically or in Europe or the Caribbean or elsewhere, where they're doing things to kind of sweeten the deal, try to make themselves more attractive for redomiciling?
I think, Stephen kind of alluded to that earlier with the premium tax holiday, but I do think we've seen that, Vermont kind of had the model captive law regulation. I've heard people say that several times. Everyone kind of modeled after that. But what you're starting to see in a lot of domestic domiciles here in the U.S. specifically is they're modifying their captive statutes to make it more friendly. Some of the states in our region recently just made it more easy to do sale captives, to do the series structure there. We started to see them work with some lower capital requirements. We've started to see states that are, they're starting to allow some coverages that are kind of non-traditional, that haven't necessarily seen in a captive before. I've seen some in the last year or two where managers and organizers will kind of go to a couple of different domiciles, and they're like, well, I'm not quite sure about that. And then they hit 2 or 3 other domiciles, and they're like, look, we'd love to work with you. One of the things that I'm still waiting to see is who's going to be, the first to really embrace the cannabis industry. That's a whole another webinar in itself, but that's here in the state. That's been a slow kind of movement, and there's a lot of talk around it. So I would expect to see, in the next 3 to 5 years, that somebody's going to come out with a statute change that they're going to embrace that and go full forward with it. But we've seen a lot of redomestication kind of come, for me personally, just among the different states. Probably in the last 6 to 7 months, I've seen 10 or 11 that have moved within different state domiciles. I had 6 or 7 that were in sales structures offshore that redomesticated into different domiciles onshore that made more sense for them. And none of those were to a home state. They found a domicile domestically that was a better fit, and that they could kind of go into their own structure on. So I do think we'll see more states kind of move and modify their statute to kind of be captive friendly, as you see some of those that as the Washington and some of those south of Washington may become a little harder to work with. And as Gary mentioned, New York and Texas, while very large states, companies that are based there, their captive statute is just not really friendly to what we would say the average captive size owner is today.
Sure. Thanks, guys. Can we move to the next slide, please? So, as we said, we've got some data on captives, and here's sort of our overall view of what's going on. And I'd just like to preface all this, for each of the slides that we're about to go through, and I don't want to turn this into an eye chart, but what we don't have, because the data is really hard to get, is cell data. So what we're seeing here in this data is very much captive data. However, it doesn't necessarily include cells. So some of the data may not tell the full story on what's happening with captives. I think that's probably the most important point to make here right off the bat. But one of the things you might notice, again, off the jump, is if you look at sort of the total effects, captive activity is relatively sort of flat, going from, say, 2016 to 2020, roughly 4-year period. So, we've seen little variations in different areas. We've especially the Caribbean markets, and then largely sort of flat movement across Europe, other regions in North America. So if we can move to the next slide, Stephen, if you could speak in a little more detail about what we're seeing from a trends perspective here within the North American region, recognizing that this largely encompasses the United States.
Sure, no, absolutely. And obviously, I'm not going to hit on each one of these individually. There's a lot of data up here, but just a couple of things I think that to point out that goes along with some of the topics we've already discussed. I mean, looking at some of these that had some bigger declines over the last 4 or 5 years: Utah, Delaware, Nevada. A lot of these were states that had a heavy concentration in 831B captives, pre the PATH Act and the IRS and enforcement and scrutiny in that area. And so, I think what we've seen in these numbers and what I've heard, is that a lot of this was just a movement from people who were either spooked by the IRS's enforcement activities or had concerns over the structure of their captive from a tax standpoint, who really decided to surrender those licenses and wind down those captive operations. And then, I think what we're seeing in the states with the larger growth, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, those three in particular, I think are maturing domiciles we're seeing. And so what we're seeing is both from a regulatory standpoint, but also from a service provider standpoint within those domiciles, we really just have a strengthening and maturing market where we have the expertise in those markets. And so we're seeing more, captives, more companies being comfortable with moving their captives to those domiciles, along with, most of those newer domiciles have, for the most part, relatively flexible regulation from a structure standpoint and just an overall flexibility on what people want to do from an investment standpoint within their captives or other means as well. So I don't know, Gary, what are your thoughts on some of those growing captive domiciles, the ones where we're seeing the bigger percent changes from your standpoint? Any other major draws to those that you're seeing out there?
Well, I think it's actually a more macroeconomic US comment in that's where the growth in America is currently as well. Those are three of the bigger. The South, there's a bit of a trend from the Northeast to the South, and I think so the growing businesses are in the South. And so the southern domiciles are seeing more activity as headquarters migrates to Texas and other places and the southern states. I mean, I think the laws are attractive, but Tennessee is a very fast growing state, and so is North Carolina. So I think a lot of it's macroeconomic as well as just that they've become more acceptable. And I've always jokingly said that it's a lot of domicile decisions used to be where was your manager? I mean, if you're a Vermont manager, Vermont looked like the only answer. If your manager's now in 12, 15 states, then the other states get a choice. So for a long time there was only 2 or 3 choices, and the choice was often driven by the manager. Now managers have got to be more flexible because at one point a lot of the states were saying you must have physical presence. I think most of them have realized that that's not practical. And also with home state, you've got a physical presence. So I think a lot of it is that's what's driving that, is that you're building this expertise. So Tennessee's been around 10 years, North Carolina close. So the businesses are there, the service providers are there, and that physical presence is being met either by home state or by managers expanding their footprint. And that's why I think we're seeing, Vermont is still a great domicile, but it doesn't have a lot of home state business. So if you've got a fronted program or an RRG, Vermont and South Carolina are still very strong candidates. But otherwise, a lot more. I mean, if you're a Tennessee business now, it's a 90% probability you'll be a Tennessee captive. And same with a lot of these others. So, I mean, Georgia's numbers are amazing, but that's almost all Georgia businesses. I still wouldn't be jumping up and down telling somebody to form a captive in Georgia if it wasn't, their home state.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sort of a newer program in their jumpstart. If we can move to the next slide, please. And Steve, if you'd briefly like to talk through what we're seeing in the Caribbean, Bermuda and the Caribbean.
Sure. Basically what we've seen there is, I think a lot of this has to do with kind of what we talked about earlier. Those that are growing can kind of be coming out of that Solvency II Act that we talked about. We've seen some things get moved around and replaced there. Bermuda and Caymans are kind of where it all started. I mean, they've always been strong, but we have seen in recent years, I had 4 or 5 captives in the last probably 12 to 18 months that have moved from Bermuda to onshore, or either from Bermuda or Caymans to another domicile. I had 7 this past year that came out of the Caymans, that moved from Caymans in a sales structure to a different domicile. But you see overall the Caymans have still increased. So, those have traditionally been some very, very strong, domiciles. But what you're seeing down there with Nevis and Anguilla and the BVI is I have seen, especially the BVI, is that I've seen a large number of captives that have moved back onshore probably 5 or 6 years ago. I had 3 that were domiciled in the BVI. of those was a large Texas-based company, kind of as Gary was mentioning. It was a Texas-based company, large size. They redomesticated back to Texas, closed down the BVI captive. I had a similar, very large Texas-based company that moved out of Bermuda a few years ago to home state. They get back into Texas, though, then you're dealing with, some of the other things like the maintenance tax that's there in Texas. I saw a question come in related to that. That's one of the taxes that we are seeing that's kind of hitting the captives once they get back into their home state. Another issue that I've seen come up again is that once they come from Bermuda or Cayman to somewhere like a Texas is the procurement taxes. One of those captives has already gotten assessed some taxes related to that because they had some operations that came into question that were out of state, and get into a question of, well, where is the Texas, as we mentioned earlier. So I think there's a lot of things kind of driving that. Gary, do you see anything else that's kind of playing into that in your world?
Well, I think Bermuda is still a relevant player, but most of what I've seen in terms of growth in Bermuda is going into cells, because the cost factors in Bermuda, cells become much more attractive option, and the Bermuda market is trying to be competitive, and so the cells work better. And obviously there's a very strong expertise in Bermuda, so cells aren't reflected in those numbers, but Bermuda is still a competitive market in a cell structure. And one of the other things about offshore, that the cells onshore have somewhat mitigated. It used to be that the surplus tests offshore included letters of credit to carriers. And so if you had a very substantial program, maybe 10 million with a front, and you had to put up like a $3 million letter of credit, Cayman and Bermuda places like that count that in their solvency margin. So you could capitalize a $10 million captive with 250 because they recognize that. But you're starting to see that happen with cells domestically. So some of that's mitigating that, but it's still potential plus if you don't want to be in a cell, that those offshore domicile solvency margin tests are sort of willing to take what I call the collateral into consideration. And that's when, as a captive manager, that can make offshore a very attractive option if you're looking at that kind of fronted program with a lot of collateral. But yeah, I think you're right with Nevis and Greenbridge Virgin Islands. Again, it's a little bit of the 831B as well. If you were an offshore 831B, there was even more problems potentially than if you're domestic, because there's some Schedule F penalties and other things that come in as well. So if you were an offshore 831B, if you decided you might want to stay it would still make sense to potentially re-domesticate it, even if you liked it, just because the extra problems that being a foreign, the 953D election being disallowed or something, without getting too deep into it, could have caused some issues. So I think that's what's hit some of those smaller ones as well.
Can we move to the next slide, please? And I think sort of in our regional view, we're going to round it out with Europe. I think this is what we're seeing here in the numbers is largely pretty consistent with what our discussions have been, especially on the back of Solvency II. Gary, any closing thoughts as we think about what's happening with the numbers in Europe?
It's hardening, but Brexit's still got to play itself out to help that. But and maybe one of these companies, maybe some innovation in Europe might be, as I said, some of these more larger domiciles other than Malta getting into the cell business to try and address that 3.5 million, if that's possible. But we're beginning to definitely see a turn in Europe, because even with Solvency II, the market is bringing attention back to captives as an option, because as rates go up, it suddenly gets people's attention again.
Indeed, indeed. Next slide, please. So, really quickly, I'm just going to talk through what we're seeing in captive formations, and I think a lot of the data that we've gone through over the last few slides probably leads us to what we're seeing here, where we're seeing substantial growth in North America, in particular North Carolina home domicile. Still seeing lots of growth in Vermont, but then also seeing growth there in Bermuda and the Caribbean. And we are continuing to see a lot of steady growth in captives. However, these seem to be the standout areas where we're seeing growth. Next slide, please. And quite the same story that we see when we're talking about license cancellations. Again, a lot of cancellations in North America, as you might expect, coming on the back of some of the regulatory changes, what we've seen happening with 831B captives, with Bermuda and the Caribbean, and talking about some of the onshore, offshore movement between the United States and Bermuda and the Caribbean. And we've also listed some of the specific domiciles where we've seen some notable drops. Next slide, please. And so I guess to sort of round it out before we start taking your questions, what we wanted to do is just sort of talk about all the things we were seeing, all the factors that we saw that we thought were driving changes. And obviously, if you have any questions and things like that, we'd love for you to put that in Slido. We'll be answering those in just a moment. But Steve, we could start with you. If you were to sort of talk through what you see as being one of the top factors for what people are thinking of when they start talking about the domicile that their captive lives in.
Yeah, I think Gary kind of alluded to it earlier, is kind of what I see is typically they look home state. And then if home state doesn't work, they start looking to see type of coverage, what states are open to certain types of coverage. If you've got to have a front to do work comp or something of that nature, there's a couple of states that are in a couple of domiciles that are really open to that and okay with it domestically, and then offshore, the fronting's been around for a long time. Once you move past that, I think it really gets into kind of like capitalization becomes a big issue. What's required? To me, those are kind of the top things to get looked at. The taxation is going to come in later. Whether it be premium tax or procurement tax or the maintenance tax that somebody had asked about earlier, I think. But those kind of come in as well. But to me, those top things are always, that I've seen are home state and then type of coverage. And, those are always going to be the kind of the top two things. What domiciles are more open to those coverage or needs. I mean, depending on where your risk management needs are.
Sure. Stephen, what are your thoughts there? Sort of closing thoughts, top reasons for movement.
No, I mean, I'd agree with everything that Steve said with that. I mean, I think, making sure outside of the home state advantage, the next tier of concern, I think, to work through is the coverage lines and the design of the program. If you need a front or if you need the reinsurance carrier on the back end, just making sure that they are comfortable and working with your state and with the regulation there, and that the regulation, allows for that type of structure. And again, I think the taxes are a concern as well. Obviously, you've got to meet those other hurdles, but once you do that and have a short list of your domiciles, I think it's important to look at the taxation concerns, any potential self-procurement issues, depending on where your underlying risk lie that are being underwritten, and then obviously the premium tax factors in there as well.
And so relative to that, with all the litigation going on with the IRS and 831B captives in particular, are there any implications for non-831B captives that you expect?
From which standpoint? So if you have a non-831B captive.
Well, just thinking about it from, say, an IRS taxation regulatory perspective.
I don't know necessarily from an IRS standpoint. I think your biggest taxation considerations, if you're a non-831B captive, again, are going to be in those self-procurement taxes. And looking at the premium taxes, if you're an RRG, looking at any kind of the retaliatory taxes that may get factored in with that as well. But I think from an IRS standpoint, I mean, as long as if you're onshore domestic, I mean, from one domicile to the next, I mean, the IRS factors are going to look the same in each of those domiciles for the most part. So it's really more getting into that state taxation issues.
Sure. Gary, closing thoughts.
I think on pretty much a global basis, cells are becoming very much the bigger thing, and having a good cell law makes you important because we're moving down market in terms of new formations. Generally, most big companies have probably already had a look at a captive or have one. So it's the developing companies or the new industry companies, cannabis and green industries that are looking at this. And so cells are becoming a very common way for companies to get their feet wet in this market. So Europe, again, Malta, obviously, then the Caribbean still has a lot of sell options, and as do both the States. So I think we're seeing an awful lot of sells become where we start with. So an attractive sell law is very important for the new marketplace. I think we've got to go to questions next.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. And I think at this point we're going to start going through the questions. So first of all, thank you for your questions. We really appreciate it. And we'll start with Rob Ramos's question. Are you seeing a lot of redomestication to home state, but then later moving back out due to the captive laws in that home state? So I guess what we're really thinking about there is it a little bit of buyer's remorse with the domicile that they chose? Steve, thoughts?
I actually have seen that a couple times where the captives came back into they actually came from offshore sales structure to an onshore sales structure in the home state, and then they eventually, after about 2 or 3 years there, they actually redomesticated out of the sales structure into standalones in another state out west because of more favorable capital requirements and some of the coverages that they were doing. So I have seen that. I don't see a lot of that. You know, typically, like I mentioned, I had 6 or 7 that redomesticated from offshore to onshore this year, and only one of those went to home state. The rest evaluated home state, but they ended up going to different states from their home states.
Sure, and I guess that probably fits with what we're seeing from a lot of the captive legislation, where it seems like more states, more domiciles are trying to make their regulatory environment more welcoming. It's a shame that the IRS is just not on board with us in that regard. The next comment we've got is, can you comment on the impact of the Texas maintenance tax, which is in addition to the standard captive premium tax? That's I think Steve and Gary, I think the two of you have worked through a captive together on that one, if you'd like to comment.
It's, most people are aware of it, and it's not that substantial. So it's certainly not, it's a lot less substantial than potentially facing the 5% or 4.85% premium tax. So it's generally not been enough of a problem that it would stop you if you're Philips, AT&T, some of the ones that have gone back to Texas. It's there, and you just got to make sure you're aware of it. It's not a very substantial amount, so it's not been a big restraint on Texas. Again, I was going to say Texas works for large Texas corporations, and it's I really wish they would update their law to be a little more receptive to some of the other stranger structures than just a large corporation. But it's not a material amount generally, I don't believe. I don't know if Steve would disagree or disagree.
No, I totally agree. Typically, the captives that I see going to Texas it's home state. They're very large companies, larger than the average captive holder that we work with, our owner, and they are aware of it. And it's just a cost that they incur because they want to be in Texas.
Absolutely, absolutely. The next question we've got is kind of wide open. So I think we might start with Stephen on this one. What's the panel's view regarding the NRRA as it applies to captive companies?
Two hours. It's not the Gun Association, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, Gary, if you'd like to take a swing at that one too.
The argument does go both ways. Most of the time, it's interesting. The Vermont is trying to argue that it doesn't. And most of the other states are actually saying, yeah, well, yes, because if we're in our home state, we want to be able to tell California, this almost fits in that we're paying taxes in our home state, so you can't tax us. So it's one of those things it's almost beneficial if you can get into a home state to make the argument that it does apply. Because if you're only paying 0.4 or 0.5% for your home state, and then you don't have to pay anything else in another state, that's wonderful. So most of the time as a captive manager, I'm going, I kind of want it to apply at the moment. Vermont is still out there trying to get Congress to recognize that it doesn't apply, and it's kind of a very tough question. I mean, so the moment we tend to take yes, it does apply, because we think it benefits if you've got the home state argument on your side.
I see it largely the same way, and if nothing else, it's a little more of a defensive stance for sure. Another question, are we seeing drops, and I'm just going to apply this, where we see drops due to the 831B question, and I think as we sort of were looking through the data, I think we would say that certainly we are seeing that in certain domiciles. Stephen, what do you think there, and what's your perspective there when as it relates to the 831B issue?
Yeah, I think it's done a good job of, for lack of a better way to say it, weeding out of some of the activity that was possibly questionable to begin with. Obviously there's a lot of legitimate programs that I think got spooked as well that really didn't have an issue that you have decided to shut down just because, again, they got spooked from the IRS's tactics and some of the communication that they sent out and the way that they've handled that. But I think the drops that we're seeing, in certain domiciles, I mean, I had mentioned a couple of the domestic ones, but then when you're looking at, the British Virgin Islands, Nevis, and some of those, I think some of that factor is the 831B issue. I think when you're looking at a bigger global scale at the market, that has caused some declines, but I also think, like Gary mentioned earlier, we're also seeing some shifting from standalone captives into cell series structures. And again, a lot of that, the cells are not included in those numbers that we were presenting today. And so that's also a big reason. I think, I saw somewhere that the estimate for the captive numbers right now, if you include the best estimate for the cell series, is somewhere around 9,500. And so, that's close to the 50% increase in the numbers we were showing today. And I don't know what that number looked like in 16. And so, yes, I do think there's a drop due to some of the 831B issues, but that is not the sole driver in what we were seeing today.
Sure. I think the next question we've got is, are certain domiciles being more restrictive on licensing RGs as well? That is, I'll take that one. And I think that is true, but we're also seeing a lot of other domiciles warming up to RRGs, and we're seeing a lot of, particularly some of the newer domiciles coming online. I know North Carolina has been trying to get into the game. Tennessee's been doing it for a while. South Carolina's had some, but I think we're actually seeing it go the opposite direction a little bit as it relates to RGs, where I think we're seeing more domiciles opening up to it.
Well, the only issue is probably trucking. There's been some major blow-ups in trucking, so some domiciles have definitely got a little gun shy on and are asking for higher capital, and most of the time it makes sense. Trucking is £30,000 missile driving down a road, so capitalizing those at $1 million is probably a little aggressive. So I think that where I'm seeing that question to me would be appropriate if you were talking about trucking, which is where a lot of the activity is currently because the market's so tough.
Sure. The next question we've got is, what does a company do if the home state is California and there is no captive law? I think we do have some options there. I'm seeing some smiles from Steve and Gary and Stephen on that one. Steve, thoughts?
I will defer to Gary, but he kind of alluded to that earlier, and he is a manager. But I would just say that when your home state, so for instance, if you're in California and there is no captive law in your home state, I would talk real closely with the manager that you're working with or talking to, and then kind of get with the tax professionals and the attorneys that are helping you structure the captive to kind of look and see what's out there and what's available, because it may be beneficial to go somewhere outside of that home state. But as Gary mentioned earlier, we're kind of looking to see if California follows that Washington example. It could open up a whole nother can of worms, so to speak.
Sure. One advantage of California, there is a self-procurement tax, and it's actually fairly low. It's about a 2% tax. With California, normally we would see the western states, Hawaii and Arizona, are good options. Try and do as little as possible in California. to try and minimize the footprint you're making there. And as a manager, we'd always say, by the way, if you're issuing a policy that the government might see, pay the self-procurement tax. It's kind of like if you're waving, don't wave a red flag in front of the government and not pay the self-procurement tax. But again, we would always probably tell you, yeah, make sure you read the California law and think if you've got a good case for not paying it, or if it's definitely a policy the government might see, pay it.
We're a little bit over on time, but just wanted to get to all the questions. The next one I think we probably would want to maybe connect with the participant offline, just because it seems to be a little bit more detailed and situation specific. But what it is if we want the option of using a future captive for stop loss layers in our self-funded medical plan, do we need to look only at domestic domiciles? I would think there we probably need to look more into the specifics of the situation, the fact pattern of what's going on, to really get into the detail of that. But again, we've got our contact information at the end of the slides. Really happy to get in touch with you and really sort of talk through what you're working on there with your captive project and process. The next question we've got is, are you seeing a lot of activity in international employee benefits being financed through US-based captives? Gary, I think that's you're probably the most knowledgeable.
More than normal. It's not a driving factor currently. It's not. I mean, yes, there still comes up once in a while, but it's not generally, we've seen those still. It's a global company normally, so there's often a second or third captive, and so it's not always flowing through the US. I've seen it. There's a US captive with a Bermuda or a Dublin captive, and sometimes the benefits are not necessarily in the US. So it's not a trend. It's definitely still comes up, but it's not a trend.
Gotcha. And the last question we've got, again, thank you all for joining, and thank you for your patience as we try to work through all these questions. Our home state is New York, thus location of the captive. Any pending regulations or trends to make doing business in New York friendlier? Very difficult and unorganized. I'd like to say that we didn't expect that, but Steve, we'll start with you. What do you think? What do you think there?
I'm not aware of anything that's on the New York books right now that really benefit or help out captives. You know, we kind of commented on the state of New York a little earlier when Gary was kind of throwing out some of the statistics and information that it is kind of a difficult place to be and to work with captives there. But I'm not aware of anything that would help make that environment more friendly.
The one trend I've seen is a couple of the New York ones I've been working with have actually formed a second captive and put the non-New York business in the second captive. If you're a New York company, only New York, not that, but if you're a New York company with business elsewhere, we're writing the New York business in New York, and we've got cell captives doing everything else somewhere else, or we're seeding it elsewhere. So it's unfortunately not a good solution, but it's once people have chosen that just because New York has been so difficult over some things that taking everything non-New York elsewhere has been attractive for them to do it.
Sure. Well, with that, I think that's our last question. Again, thanks Steve, Stephen, and Gary. Really appreciate you guys jumping on today, and thanks for being a part of this webinar. But also thank you to all the participants. Thank you all for sticking with us. I know we went about 5 minutes over. We just had a lot of questions as we started. They just kept rolling in. So we really appreciate your questions. We appreciate your time and your attention. And thank you again for joining us. If we can help you in any way, please feel free to reach out. Again, our contact information is in the slide deck.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.